Hello, we are on part 8 of the Seminole War Heritage Trail. And just to refresh it, if you're new to this booklet is a free booklet that we put together with the Seminole War Foundation, the Florida Department of State. And if you look in the description below, you can actually download a PDF of the book. And there's copies that you can get at some of the museums. But let's go to our map here. It's in the very middle of the book. So, where we are going tonight, we had just finished this orange area. We're going into this dark blue area with Volusia County, Seminole, Orange. Stopped by briefly at Lake and Brevard County and some mention of Osceola County. It's not getting left out of the fun. So we're we'll start out with a spot that's not in the booklet for some reason. Probably should be. This is Addison Blockhouse, and this is Tomoka River State Park. And I think the probably the reason why it was not included is because it's very difficult to reach. You have to go by canoe or kayak up the Tomoka River. You don't think you can. There might be a trail going to it, but it's very remote. It's very hard to get to. Do not laugh at the little tarp that's over it. It's protecting it from the weather, and the Park Service has no money at all. When I was with the Park Service, there was times when we did not even have money to buy light bulbs to replace in the restrooms in the campground. So they're doing what they can to try to help preserve the site. The story behind the Addison Blockhouse was at the beginning of the war, the South Carolina militia came down to Florida and was patrolling the East Coast and kind of made this little fortified blockhouse here. I don't know how much of a blockhouse because it's a very small structure. I don't know how you can even fit a company of men inside. So it's that and has what looks like a tower or a chimney or something. It's a very unusual structure in Tomoka State Park, but there's something you can get to. And if you're not far away from that area, at least as the crow flies, is the Dummett Plantation Ruins, Dummett, uh, in Tomoka State Park. But if you're driving, I think it's A1A or Highway 1, A1, and you're driving past Tomoka State Park, and there's a few residential houses, and there will be a strip of woodlines and this ruins right there. It's a bit startling the way it just kind of pops up out of the woods with these chimneys and these ruins of these walls, and there's a picnic table next to them too. So that's pretty interesting. The sugar plantations were operated from the British period until the United States at the beginning of the Second Seminole War in 1835. Actually, before the war started, Miccosukee Chief King Philip or Amathla and his son Kawakachi destroyed all the sugar operations, all the plantations along the east coast of Florida, south of St. Augustine. So it was destroying a very economic industry, major industry in East Florida at this time. Now, here is further south in Port Orange, you have the Battle of Dunlawton Plantation. And this was in 1835. Notice on the historical marker, it mentions Major Benjamin Putnam. In fact, we even saw a picture of him in the last video. They were here and they kind of get chased out by the Seminoles at the time. And in fact, one of the soldiers was shot in the butt trying to get the boat unstuck off the mud flat because of low tide. And there's a nearby marker, and this is a new one. So this is not in our guidebook. King Philip or Mathila, who burned all the plantations with his son Kawakachi. Uh, and so that's pretty neat. Got a marker for him. Of course, in the background, you can see, I guess they built a roof over the plantation ruins. which they've always been like a scenic tourist spot of the area. Here it is from an old postcard in the early 1900s. And of course, you can still tell it's the same ruins in this photograph here. I think this was in the 1990s before they built the roof on top. You, of course, see the cane grinding. It was, even though it was burned down by the Seminoles, it was still operated as a sugar plantation during the Civil War to process sugars. And here is a painting by Captain John Rogers Vinton, who was commanding a fort at New Smyrna. And he painted this painting about 1839. It's, I think, one of the most scenic paintings in the Seminole War. I like this one quite a bit. In fact, I used it for my background there. Now, the New Smyrna Sugar Mill Ruins is another sugar mill ruins park south of that. And of course, the town of New Smyrna. Kind of interesting here history. Earlier, you notice on the postmark it said Spanish sugar mill. Well, it was not. Even in the early 1900s, the Catholic Church was promoting these these ruins as a Spanish mission. There's kind of an interesting story because a historian, Charles Coe, who was a researcher from Washington, I think he worked for the Department of Revenue. His great grandson will probably chime in the video because he watches my videos. And correct me on this. I think he was with the Department of Revenue or something, but he was real good at researching, and he wrote the book Red Patriots in 1890, one of the first good books on the Seminole War since the Seminole War ended, since John T. Sprague wrote his book in 1848. Anyway, another interesting story. This was a roadside attraction for a while called Bongo Land and had concrete statues of dinosaurs. I think the statues actually still remains. It's a state park today, so they just interpret that as just an interesting time of the tin can tourist era. Roadside attractions from the 1840s or the 1940s to the 1970s. I'm getting my centuries mixed up. Further to the southwest, you have DeLeon Springs State Park. This used to be a resort, had a hotel next to the springs at one time, and the sugar mill right here, it's now a restaurant where you can actually cook your own pancakes on the grill. I think you have to make reservations because it's quite a busy place. And I used to swim in the springs a lot. We At one time we had a reenactment here that we reenacted it. It was in August and godly hot. And the one reason we came here is we got to jump in the springs in our outfits after the battle reenactment was over. Kind of interesting here. This was the plantation of Charles Woodruff, I believe, the Woodruff brothers, known as Spring Garden Plantation. Actually, several ownerships. I think Orlando Reeves was another one. Uh, because of the water here, it, helped in the operation of the sugar mill and the plantation. On the To the left, out of view of this shot of the spring, there's a Aboriginal mound. In fact, there's a house built into it, but part of the mound is leaching into the spring head, and the shell from the mound would actually create like glittering type uh, interesting effect that would create on the springs. Inside the spring is found the oldest Aboriginal canoe found in North America. I think it was about 6,000 years old or 8,000 years old. I haven't looked up that information in a long time. I know Pedro would know. So a lot of history on this site. Now the water flows into Spring Garden Creek, which goes into the Lake Woodruff Wildlife Refuge. In Lake Woodruff, there's an island known as Tick Island, and yes, it has ticks. It was actually visited by William Bartram. The Native Americans on the island actually had a charnel house where they would place the dead and Over time, as they decay, they take the bones and bury the bones in the mound once they're done. And unfortunately, a lot of the mound was taken away in the 1970s for road fill, which is unfortunate. I actually used to visit out there in the 1980s. My mom was one of the anthropologists doing the salvage archaeology in this area with, I think it was Ripley Bolin in the early 1970s. So a lot of interesting history. Now, if you go further upriver on the St. Johns, which is heading south, you'll get to, was it Pontoon Island? There's an Aboriginal mound there. In fact, there is a village. And on the other side of the river from Pontoon Island is Blue Springs, where there's another Aboriginal mound and the Thursby House. So a lot of history, we don't include those in the Seminole War Guidebook because not so much dealing with Seminole War history, but dealing with the native history in Florida. There's just so much to see in Volusia County, Florida. Now, if you're heading down the highway from here, I think it's Highway 40 going into Lake County, cross over the St. Johns River. There's a big oak tree there, and there's this little historical marker about the community of Volusia. Volusia was another spot visited by William Bartram. William Bartram, he got around, and this is a really good marker because it has a lot of information. Mentions that it was the upper store of the Panton Wesley Indian Trading House. Um, there used to be a museum here, run by a lady. Her name was Lillian Gibson, I believe. I visited it 40 years ago, and she is 90 years old at the time, so she's no doubt passed away by now. The collection of the museum, I believe, went to Barberville Museum. That's another historical site that's worth visiting, Pioneer Village on the Highway 40. And so if you go across the bridge here on the Lake County side, you'll get to a historical marker. Go slow. If you blink, you'll miss it. Fort Butler. Notice at the bottom of the historical marker is Coontie Route. I think that's a really great touch there. The Coontie Route, there's also Fort Call, stood at the is same place or near here. Uh, there's three different forts in this area: Fort Butler, Fort Call, and Fort Barnwell. I think Fort Butler was, I think during the Jessup's campaign mainly. And so before we leave Lake County, let's head further to the southwest. Off of Highway 90 near Umatilla is Fort Mason. In fact, I did a video on Fort Mason, I think a few months ago. In fact, I visited the marker here. When I visited the marker, there's a restaurant next door, coincidentally known as the Mason Jar. So I said, I gotta stop. And so I had Sunday breakfast there, then got photographs of the marker. I said, I just couldn't pass up the opportunity. Going down south into Seminole County, you have the site of King Philip, one of his villages. On the north side of Lake Monroe, there's a Seminole War fort here known as Fort Kingsbury. I really can't find much information. I think it was just a R&R, rest and relaxation area of the soldiers. On the North Shore, it was basically where the boats would land on the North Shore of Lake Monroe, and there was a road that would go New Smyrna from there. And King Philip had his village, I believe, also on top of a indigenous mound, just to keep out of the river flooding. Before we go into Sanford, let's take a side trip to the east and go to Fort Wayne in Geneva, Florida, in Seminole County. I think this park, there's a picnic pavilion. I think it was built by the CCC, but they have a historical marker for this, and it's two-sided. Interesting Fort Wayne, named after Captain John F. Lane, who was head of the Creek Regiment, who died at Fort Drane as soon as he got into Florida. That's another story. Um, Geneva is a small historical community from here, not far from Fort Christmas, I guess. One of the forts that was used as a temporary supply depot on the St. Johns River when General Jessup was heading upriver, heading south upriver, until he cut across the peninsula and went up the Atlantic instead. And then it was abandoned after that. Going back into Sanford, south of Lake Monroe, there's Fort Reed, the historical marker at this park here. Fort Reed is pretty much where the soldiers were kept. They'd bring the steamboats up the St. Johns, unload them at Fort Mellon, which was I guess, the furthest up the St. Johns that the boats would go at the time before Jessup had his campaign. And they would unload the boats and would be the main entrance to going into the interior peninsula in central Florida. Fort Reed was garrisoned by the 2nd Dragoons under Colonel David Twiggs and Lieutenant Colonel William S. Harney in 1840, finally abandoned in 1841. The Dragoons would use this as their kind of base of operations for scouting the area up the St. Johns or the Wekiva River in this area. So let's go into Sanford. And at Sanford, there's a Riverwalk Park. You have the site of Fort Mellon. Here is a marker that is put up by the Daughters of the American Revolution, and nearby is another marker here. And I got this photo years ago when they had just redone the landscaping. Site of Fort Mellon, battle here in February 8th, 1837, between King Philip and Cowackachee when they attacked the fort. A very large battle, significant skirmish. And right here in Sanford, in this park, I think the park next door, the big open area, it's my theory that that was the parade grounds of Fort Mellon. I'm not sure if it was or not, but anyway, this Fort Mellon, and nearby is the Sanford Historical Museum on the other side of the green from where this marker is. Definitely worth a visit. There's actually two history museums in Seminole County, Sanford. If you go down 1792, and I think it's just south of, it used to be Seminole Community College. Now I think it's Seminole State College. It's the Seminole County Historical Society Museum. Definitely well worth because they cover some history there. I hadn't been there in a few years, so I don't have any good pictures of that. But if you look in the notes in the description for this video, you'll see a link to both these museums. So going down the road from here, we've stopped by at Fort Mellon. We're going south into what's now Orange County, down the road to, before we get to Fort Gatlin, we pass by the side of Fort Maitland. And here it is at Fort Maitland Park. Unfortunately, we'll algae mildew on the marker here. Um, this along 1792. And here it is backing up of the more of a wide view of the park on the shore of Lake Maitland. The original name of the lake was Lake Fumachalaga, which basically means a place, stinky place or place of the musk melons, which is a particular melon that comes from, I believe, Haiti or Jamaica in the Caribbean that has a particular smell. Now, from here, the road from Fort Mellon would go past Maitland and down to Fort Gatlin, which is now Orlando. Here's the historical marker in southwest Orlando for Fort Gatlin. Originally, it was named after John S. Gatlin, who was killed in Major Dade's command when the Seminoles attacked them on December 28th, 1835. So they named the fort after him here, and it was in operation for 6 months during the height of the Second Seminole War. There used to be a Navy sonar lab across the street. I remember when we were trying to save the property and get a historical marker put up, and I remember going to meetings for that. That was done by Linda Stewart, who was a county commissioner at the time and later a state senator. So, I got to see part of that being done. In fact, I was in Linda Stewart's house. So that was pretty cool when we had our meetings about the historical marker. She probably doesn't remember me because I didn't wear my Seminole outfit when I was there. Now, if you go into downtown Orlando, right in center of town, Lake Eola, a famous lake, has a park all around it. On the was the east side of the lake, they have this monument to Orlando Reeves right here. It's kind of interesting because as far as we know, this is uh, probably folklore of something that never happened. Orlando Reeves was supposedly a soldier guarding around here at Lake Eola one night, and his Seminole jumped up and shot him with an arrow, and the other soldiers killed him. As far as we know, we have no documentation saying that ever happened. We have no record of a soldier named Orlando Reeves. Uh, one theory is that the uh, story is that they found a log with a name carved on it, Orlando Reeves, and the last part of the name was obscured. They think that was the plantation owner, Orlando Reeves, who had a plantation at Spring Garden, which we were at earlier one time, and he carved his name in the log. And later on, people saw that and they made up a story on that. Now, if you go on the other side of Lake Eola, you have the Orange County Regional Historical Center in the former post office. I don't have a picture on that. My mom used to volunteer there, but I really hadn't been there since 2000. So I don't have much to show to that one. And that would be on the opposite side of Lake Eola from this here in the downtown Orlando. Definitely worth a visit. Now, if you go East Orange County again, you have reconstructed Fort Christmas, East Highway 50 between Orlando and Cocoa Beach, or Orlando and Titusville. Reconstructed Fort Christmas, the community, Fort Christmas, and now it's Christmas, developed around where Fort Christmas was. Fort Christmas was not a major fort. It only was in existence 3 or 4 months during General Jessup's campaign, but a community was built up around it. And in the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps established this park near the location of the fort. The exact location was probably somewhere in the cow pasture across the street. This is Florida cow country. And in 1976, as part of the bicentennial, with the help of the Army Corps of Engineers, they rebuilt Fort Christmas. And this is a great park to visit. It has a pioneer village outside of it. Originally, it was just the fort and the picnic pavilion built by the CCC. And over the years, they got several pioneer cabins and moved them to the park here and rebuilt them. So as the area started to get developed, the cabins wouldn't fall down to ruin, and they're rebuilt. They One of the buildings behind the fort, and I don't think you can see it, is the old Christmas schoolhouse, which is a two-story building. Very interesting. Here's a historical marker right in front of the fort at Fort Christmas. This was along the roadside, disappeared for several years. It showed up anonymously at Fort Christmas, so they remounted it here on this in this frame. So the historical marker found its way back home. Now, going back over to Brevard County as we cross over in the St. Johns River one last time for this video is you go on, I think this is on Merritt Island, you go Titusville and then head south on Merritt Island. This is Hull Over Canal. This was significant during the Seminole War because this was the crossing over point of where the soldiers would cross over from the Atlantic to the intercoastal waterway, the Indian River, which was much better water for boating on because you don't have the waves that you have out at the Atlantic. One of the most deadliest non-combat related incidents happened during the Seminole War when a boat full of soldiers capsized and about a dozen soldiers drowned. in the river, and that's a boat ferrying for the military operation at the time. So another non-combat disaster of boats that killed a lot of people was the steamboat Dolphin, which boiler exploded off the coast off of St. Augustine and killed one of the officers in the Second Seminole War. That was a civilian disaster. And another historical marker here is the Hernandez Trail during Jessup's campaign in 1837, 1838, when General Jessup came down the St. Johns River from Fort Mellon, established Fort Lane, Fort Christmas, and Fort McNeil. There used to be a historical marker for Fort McNeil, but it disappeared several years ago and it's not been seen since then, unfortunately. But I actually do remember seeing that historical marker when my scout troop would go on campouts, and we actually passed by that historical marker in East Orange County. Hernandez Trail, named after General Joseph Hernandez from St. Augustine. He established Fort Anne in this area on the East Coast. Does it mention Fort Anne? No, I don't see it on here. But anyway, he had several successful operations. General Jessup, of course, went further south, and they established Fort Pierce and Fort Jupiter, led to the Battle of Jupiter Inlet, and that's a video for another time. And I don't have any pictures of the last uh, stop. This is not in the Seminole War Trail Guide, Seminole War Heritage Trail Guide. But in Osceola County, the Osceola Historical Society has made a I guess a pioneer village or whatever they call. So definitely worth checking that out. I actually haven't been there because the last time I was in the area was on the weekend when it was closed. So check out that and their historical society. Of course, you have to stop by in the county named after Osceola. So that's it for now. I covered one whole section of the booklet in one video. Next time will be West Central Florida, and that'll definitely be in more than one video. And so I'll see you later.